Without further ado, though, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today, Debbie Biddle. So Deborah is a DreamBank veteran at this point, a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant and extraordinaire, which is what she will actually be talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Debbie. Debbie, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to be here to learn about some things not to do when implementing DEI, and I'm going to talk about 15 best practices as well. So I will make this presentation available to you. So if you would like it, I'll put my email address in the chat and you can send it to me. Send me your request for the PowerPoint and I'll get it out to you. I'll just tell you up front, there's a lot of information, especially on the back end, that you may want to write down that I'll probably go fast enough where you won't get it all down right the first time. So just know that you can get the presentation. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump in. We're going to talk about a lot of things that have happened that I've learned over my experience doing this work with a lot of different companies, from for-profit to nonprofit and across industries and different sizes of organizations, things that are working well and things that I've learned that you should have in place or shouldn't do when you're launching your DEI initiative at your workplace. So I wanted to just start out by talking about, by now you've probably heard about the McKinsey & Company research that they've done on diversity, equity, and inclusion and the benefits of it. We know that DEI is not just the right thing to do, but it drives profit as well. So whether you're in this work thinking about it from a moral perspective, or thinking about it as a social justice concern, or you're wanting to do it for some personal reason, or because your employees are saying you should do it, know that it also, for those of you who are motivated by profits, it also drives financial experience and financial results as well. As you can see in this diagram, McKinsey has been doing this research since 2014, and there's been an increase in financial performance through hiring more women at the executive level and through hiring more racial and cultural and ethnic diversity as well. And you can see that the percentages have increased over the years that they've done this research. So I say all that to say that increasing DEI in the workplace is a priority for business today, and it's not really a big surprise. If you think about all that has happened in our culture over the last 5 to 10 years, you think about the justice-involved events with people of color, think about the impact of the healthcare crisis, of economic and social justice concerns, think about the Me Too movement, about the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, think about COVID-19. All of that has highlighted the fact that there are disparities in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that we need to do something about it. So organizations of all sizes in all industries have more or less jumped on the bandwagon to get involved in this work. We know that the greater the representation, the higher the likelihood of outperformance. So companies with more than 30% women executives have experienced higher financial outcomes and better performance than those who have less than 30% women executives. And they're also more likely to outperform those who have even fewer executives or have none at all who are women. So I think it's been pretty obvious over the last 30 to 40 years that the impact of having women in the C-suite is very significant. When we look at what it means to have more diversity in the workplace, especially at the leadership levels, we know that the top quartile of companies for ethnic and cultural diversity outperform those in the fourth quartile by 36% in profitability. So that is a huge difference. And this research was done with over 1,000 companies in, I believe, 36 different countries of all different sizes. And the trend pretty much holds true. And it has held true since they first started doing this research. So if you're wondering about whether or not you should really take a more assertive stance on moving women into executive roles, or people of color, or people from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, the answer is yes, you should be working on that and thinking about how to get that done. There are two critical factors that researchers have found to be really important when it comes to having successful DEI initiatives. And the first one is to have a systematic business-led approach to DEI. So not something that's necessarily, oh, we think this is a great idea, let's do it, or jumping on the bandwagon, but really being thoughtful and systematic about it, and then taking bold action on inclusion. So when you think about a systematic business-led approach, some components of that would include having a robust business case that is tailored to the needs of your company. So going through having the conversations with your executive team and really answering the question, why are we doing this? What is our motivation for this? What is the impact that we hope to make? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And tailoring that to your company, meaning that you're not going and pulling someone else's strategy or someone else's business case, but you're looking at the marketplace, you're looking at your employees, you're looking at the community and the impact you want to make there, partnerships, you're looking at suppliers, you're really looking at the whole spectrum of what your business case could be to have you be involved in a DEI initiative and how to make it successful. You're looking at evidence-based targets. So again, not something that's nice to do, although nice to do can have evidence behind it, but you want to be specific in your criteria to understand what are the targets you're trying to make an impact on. If it's recruiting, you want to improve your ability to recruit effectively in terms of having more people with disabilities, or more people who are justice involved, or more veterans, whatever it might be. Where's the evidence, your baseline for starting, and how much do you want to make a difference? And then looking at your diverse representation at leadership levels. I just told you that having more diversity at the executive levels helps your profitability significantly. So again, looking at where you sit, if you have no ethnic or racial diversity or no women in your leadership structure, then what are you doing? What is the path you're going to take to make that happen? And then looking at your core business leadership accountability. You've heard the phrase probably that what gets measured is what gets done. The same holds true for DEI. If you're just throwing out random objectives, or just saying, oh, it would be nice to have this, but you're never tracking it to make sure you're making progress, then you probably won't see much difference in the end. And somebody has to be held accountable for the work. And I believe that accountability begins at the leadership level. People have to understand what's in it for them. They have to understand what's in it for the organization, and they have to be motivated to make the necessary changes and to positively talk about why it is that you're doing this work. And holding leaderships, especially those people who are responsible for business units or organizational departments and structures responsible for moving DEI ahead, will get you further along the path of seeing your culture change and seeing some positive fruits in terms of recruiting or supplier diversity or community partnerships or philanthropy. The second piece is taking that bold action on inclusion. Most often people talk about diversity, but they forget about the equity and inclusion piece. So when we're talking about that bold action, what are you doing from an equity standpoint? What are you doing to remove the barriers to employment, to training, to education and advancement when it comes to people? But also, what are you doing as a corporate citizen or an organizational citizen, a community partner? What are you doing to advance progress for diverse suppliers in your organization? How are you tearing down anything that would get in the way of your organization being successful in this work? Then looking at openness, having and maintaining an unbiased, non-discriminatory, harassment-free workplace. What have you done with the culture to say it's safe to be here, that we respect everyone who comes into our experience, whether it's from an employee side, a supplier side, a client or a customer side, a patron, a participant side? How are we creating space that is safe and welcoming, where people can thrive and feel like they can be successful there. And then lastly, creating a sense of belonging. So in addition to hiring diverse talent, what are we doing to create an experience that helps people be able to thrive, especially looking at underrepresented people? What are our behaviors that say this is an organization where everyone, regardless of their diversity, dimensions, characteristics, or identities, can belong and do their best work? So 10 things to avoid when trying to grow a culture of DEI within your organization. One is just not understanding your organization's readiness. Sometimes there's someone in the organization who's really passionate about this work. It could be the CEO, it could be the HR director, it could be an employee or a first line manager. I don't know where the impetus would come from, but there's usually somebody who's really, really passionate about it. But you haven't laid a great foundation and your organization isn't prepared to do the work. Maybe there's something happening within the economy, or maybe there's some regulatory thing happening in your industry. Maybe you just aren't that great at culture change, or you just may not have communicated well when it comes to putting together a DEI initiative. So if your organization isn't ready, then you have to lay the groundwork. If you have laid the groundwork, but maybe you're moving too fast, then you need to slow down and go at the pace that your organization can be successful. And that doesn't mean you don't push people a little bit, but you can't run faster than your organization is willing to go. And so that means you have to do the groundwork to get them there. A second thing to avoid is not having top leadership buy-in, commitment, and advocacy for the work. I just believe that it's critical that the CEO and the C-suite are on board with this. So taking a step back to make sure that you have communicated with them, that they have talked about why it's important, that they understand the need to do this, that they are committed to this work because it's going to take a long time, and because it's going to take a lot of energy and resources, and that they advocate for this work, that they're not just saying, okay, you go do it as the DEI person, or you go do it in HR. Yes, we support you, go forth, but they are out there shoulder to shoulder with you as the person leading the initiative, talking about why it's important, attending trainings, out in the community, talking about the work you're doing, that they're sharing the results, that they're on the hook for results from an accountability perspective. So if you don't have the support from the C-suite, that makes it harder for you to get the work done. It's not impossible, but it is harder. Not understanding the required commitment. So the commitment takes people, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes money, and it takes a lot of effort. And it's not just the effort, again, of that one individual who's leading the charge for the work. It takes a concerted effort from leadership. That person needs to be kind of scrappy and entrepreneurial and be able to get a committee at a minimum, but really network across the organization to get buy-in and support and get people involved and engaged and excited about DEI, and be able to communicate about it in a positive, enthusiastic way, because it's not a punishment, it's not a burden. It's something that we're doing because we want our organizations to be better, to be the kind of places where people want to come and be a part of and thrive and are excited about, not organizations that feel like, oh, this is yet another thing for us to do. So we have to understand, though, that once we say we're on the DEI train, it's a train that goes on as long as the organization is in existence, because it's just as essential. Because I have an accounting background, I liken DEI to the same concept of a going concern financially. As long as you're going to be in business, you want to have financial success. As long as you're in business from a DEI perspective, you want to have inclusive, equitable, diverse organizational success. So another thing to think about when it comes to things things to avoid is not understanding that DEI is not straightforward or uncomplicated. It's not linear. It doesn't have an step A, B, C, D, E. It doesn't have a 1, 2, 3, and you check it off on your to-do list. And if I do all these things, I'm there. No, I'd like it if it were that way, but every organization is different. Every organization's priorities are different. Even within organizations, from department to department and team to team, it can be different. What motivates people is different. And it's different because it's not like rolling out a system implementation where you just follow the instructions, you notify people of the changes, you do a few edits here and there, it's mandated from the top and proof it happens. And I'm oversimplifying that because I've been a part of those, and those are complicated too. But with DEI work, we're talking about unpacking people's lived experience from the time they were born until today. We're talking about things that their mothers and fathers and aunties and uncles and grandparents taught them, and that they may hold sacred in their families, and unpacking that to see what it means for the workplace. We're talking about grafting in every single person's life experience underneath the umbrella of our organizational vision, mission, and values, and then saying, here's how we're going to operate from a business or organizational perspective. And it might require a shift in terms of what we think or believe, or our ways of being and interacting with one another as individuals and as an organization. And that can be a little bit complicated, and it takes time. So if we don't understand that, then we're going to be frustrated in the process. Another thing to avoid is putting the burden on people of color. DEI work is not work that is just for people of color. It is work for every single person in the organization. And we can't be asked to be the spokesperson for this. We don't necessarily need to be the people to chair the committee. We don't even need to be the DEI officer or director or coordinator or whatever the role may be. Now, some of us may be happy to do it and may want to, but putting the burden there by having to explain everything about all of our personal culture and all what it means to be a minority and the history of slavery in America. It's not our role to explain all of those things and to explain oppression. It may happen and people may be willing to unpack that with you in conversation, but the growth and the learning is everyone's responsibility. The people of color or the underrepresented people in your organization, whether they be veterans or people with disabilities or the LGBTQ community, they are not the ones that are doing the work. Everyone's doing the work, and they're not your personal Google. They are there to learn and grow just like you are. Number 6 is being overly boastful or performative. That happened a lot during COVID and after George Floyd's murder. People jumped out making these wonderful statements and talking about how great their organizations were. And then when we checked back a couple years later, we noticed that not much progress was made, that it was more words than it was action. And so we want to make sure that whatever statements we make, whatever actions we take are coming from an authentic place and a place that is really trying to advance inclusion and equity within our organizations and as we partner out in the community. Ignoring the small things is also one of the things to avoid. A lot of times we get caught up in having a big, robust strategy for DEI that takes us years and years to accomplish, but there are little things we can be doing along the way, and we shouldn't ignore those. Like if we're missing Heritage Months, or we're not paying attention to our employees who we have right on our team already, if we're not acknowledging the diversity that exists within our team by creating inclusive environments for the people who are already there, even if they're all white, then we're not doing a good job of inclusion. Inclusion starts right where you are. We already have diversity, even though we might be the same racial or ethnic identity. We don't all think alike. We haven't all grown up and experienced the same things. We don't have the same personalities. There's a lot that's different about us that we need to understand and appreciate about one another. We have different work styles, thinking styles, and on and on and on. So don't ignore the small things. Don't ignore treating people with dignity and respect. Don't ignore smiling at people. Don't ignore paying attention to what the ways of communicating with your other team members that makes them feel valued and important. So those are things we can be doing every day. There are little things we can do, potlucks, book clubs, on and on and on. Don't ignore the small things while also trying to create impactful strategies along the way. One of the other things to avoid is focusing on diversity without an equal or stronger emphasis on building an inclusive culture. A quote that I remember often is that diversity really doesn't mean much at all if we're only listening to a few voices in the organization. So you can have the most diverse room in terms of what it looks like, but if the only voices being heard are white males over 50, then you haven't created an inclusive culture. Or if the only voices being heard are one other specific group of folks, you haven't created diverse and inclusive culture. If you are unwilling to make accommodations for people who show up in the workplace differently and who need something else to be successful, something other than what the majority needs, then you aren't creating equity or inclusion. If you aren't looking for ways to break down equity or unnecessary processes and unravel all of that, then you aren't really creating equity and inclusion. So think about that as you decide what your priorities are for this work. Number 9 is focusing only on recruiting. That is probably the most common sticking point that I will say that I see organizations fall into. They think that having a diversity initiative means I should hire more people of color. If that's the only thing you're doing, then I think you're missing the boat almost completely. As I said earlier, if you haven't done the work to create an inclusive culture, then hiring that diversity isn't going to mean a whole lot, because you haven't created the space for people who are different. So you may get them in the door, but 6 months later, they'll be gone. And you'll just have this revolving door of people who look different. But what you really want to do is also look at, how are you developing people? How are you treating people fairly and respectfully and inclusively? How are you breaking down barriers to access? How are you creating opportunities by hiring more diverse, or by working with more diverse suppliers? How are you helping other organizations to be more diverse by saying that you'll only work with suppliers who also value diversity, equity, and inclusion? What kind of partnerships are you engaged in that will expose your organization to different ways of doing, being, thinking, and working? And how are you partnering with other organizations to help them grow? What is the impact that you are making in the community through your partnerships? And what kind of philanthropy are you engaging in an equitable way, where you're coming to the table not telling organizations what you're going to do, but asking them how you can help them do what they have the knowledge and expertise to do better. And then number 10, not measuring your progress. This is also huge. I think if you haven't created and established a baseline for where you are today through some sort of assessment, and then creating a plan with strategies, goals, and objectives that are time bound, and then measuring your progress at regular intervals, then you won't be able to say, or you just won't have, you may have anecdotal knowledge about some changes that have occurred, but you won't have any concrete knowledge to really be able to articulate and quantify the difference that inclusion and equity have made in your organization. So those are the 10 things I think you need to avoid. There are many more, but those are the things that jump out in my mind. So I want to shift real quick to some things that you can do to create a more inclusive, world-class, DEI workplace. And these come from the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion benchmarks from the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. So you can look that up when you get a chance. But I'll go through these. These are a little bit more detailed. I think it's important for us to go through them. So I'll try to get through them as quick as I can so that we have time for questions at the end. But the first one is to develop a strong rationale for DEI vision, mission, strategies, and align them to your organizational goals. It's critical that you do this work in conjunction with the overarching plan for the organization. DEI should not be a side, I was going to say a side piece or a side initiative. It should be integrated and seen by the whole organization as just part of what we do. So if your leaders are thinking about this well, you'll be at the table with the R&D folks, the finance folks, the sales, the marketing people. You'll be right in the thick of this, asking the questions about how does this marketing plan address our need to be more equitable? How are we embracing diversity by coming up and developing with new products and services? How are we going to market to people in broader regions of the world or expand our marketplace because we are being more inclusive? Those are strategic questions that you can be asking as part of this work. So you want to ensure that DEI is part of the values, part of everything that you do, so that it will help you expand and really achieve your success, your goals, your growth that you're looking for. So you want to have a clear DEI vision and mission. So it should be articulated somewhere on paper. You want to clearly understand the business impact that you're trying to make by doing DEI work. And then you want to measure the progress, as I've talked about. You want to make sure that your strategy has numeric goals, so quantifiable goals, as well as qualitative goals around success for DEI, and make sure that it includes representation in the organization from entry level all the way up to the board of directors. Secondly, you want to hold leaders accountable for implementing the DEI vision and setting goals and results, and for being role models. It's really important that your executives are walking the talk when it comes to DEI, and not just the executives, but every person in the organization. What I like to see teams do is actually come up with DEI competencies for every single person in the organization, so that they know how they are expected to and how they can impact DEI through the behaviors and the work that they do every day. And you can develop that model, then implement into your performance management system, and then get that work done. You make sure that your leaders and your board members understand your DEI goals and objectives, and that they are aware that it is critical to how they manage and oversee their own duties. You want to make sure that they publicly support DEI, and that they do that internally as well as externally out in the community to other business organizations. If they sit on boards of directors, that they're doing it there, that they're held accountable, that they position DEI as key to their organization's strategy, to their sustainability, and that they create an environment that is going to be one of a coaching environment. So it's not punitive, but we're talking about how do we create psychological and physical safety in the workplace, and we're coaching everyone along that path, because we all have work to do to grow in that area. And then we're including DEI competency building when it comes to evaluation. So what I talked about before, how are we building the competencies at every level so that we can help people when it comes to how we think about our succession planning, who's moving into leadership. When I talk about leadership capabilities, I should be lining up DEI competency right alongside their skill to do the technical aspects of their job. The third one is to provide visible, dedicated support and structure with authority and budget to effectively implement. If we're going to get this work off the ground, I recognize that probably all of you come from different size organizations, and it's difficult to immediately staff up, fully staff and support DEI, but you ought to have a plan for how you're going to do it. I see a lot of organizations will throw it on to somebody who already has a full-time job, and basically they're doing it for free, or they're carving out maybe 5% of their time to do it. And then they recognize that it's a bigger job than that. And so they have to give more time, or they cobble together a committee and spread it out over 8 people and they try to get it all done. And it doesn't really work the best way. Sometimes it will, but most of the time it struggles. So make sure that you are thinking about how you're going to have a dedicated resource who has expertise in DEI that can be part of your management team, because you want that person to have a voice at the executive level. They need to have a presence at the board level as well. And then they need to have access to the rest of the leadership team. Having, again, that professional staff is critical if your organization is large enough to afford it, to merit it, and you really want to make change and you want to make it consistently at a decent pace of time. Again, having part-time or not fully dedicated people to this makes it really difficult to do. Make sure that that person does engage and network with a whole lot of people across the organization, that you have teams and committees that are working on it. You assign champions to do the work. DEI is not a solo proposition. It has to be done in conjunction with the rest of the leadership in the organization, who are going to deploy people on their teams to make this work. And make sure, lastly, that they have enough budget. A lot of organizations that I work with who struggle with this do not adequately resource it financially. If you're not, I mean, to me, the proof is in the pudding. You got to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to DEI. If you're not going to resource it, then don't talk to me about it, because you cannot do it for free. It costs money to do DEI, just like it costs money to do everything else. People need to have marketing, they need to have staff, they need to have administrative support, they need to have access to systems, they need to be able to, purchase supplies and have events and do all the stuff that training, consulting, all the things that the rest of the organization needs. It needs to happen in DEI as well. The fourth one is to ensure that attraction, sourcing, and recruitment is done through a lens of DEI. So when you're talking about recruiting, when you're looking at suppliers, you're doing that through a DEI lens, not just looking at who your friends are or who your go-to folks are. But if you say you're committed to DEI, to inclusion, to equity, then you have to ask the question, who are the diverse suppliers? Who are the diverse candidates? What can we do differently to attract them? What are the barriers that are keeping us from being able to attract these people, these vendors? And what are the barriers that we have put in place that make it difficult for us to attract and source and recruit? So looking at applicants from diverse groups, doing that equitably, advertising and recruiting specifically to diverse communities and diverse suppliers. Having diversity on your interview panels becomes standard, not the exception, or only when you have a culturally diverse candidate coming in, but you do it all the time. That you educate your hiring staff, whether they are managers or HR folks, on the impact of conscious and unconscious bias. That you regularly review your recruiting process to make sure it's equitable, that you are hiring underrepresented groups in proportion to their representation in the community where you operate, or organization-wide, if you're a global organization, that you're looking regionally within those areas and doing your recruiting or your hiring proportionately. And the same with suppliers, when it comes to sourcing that way, and making sure, again, that you have metrics that are going to be in place for your recruiting. The fifth one is to ensure that DEI is integrated into talent development, performance management, advancement, and retention. So you're consciously looking at your diversity across every level and every function. And you're looking at high potential folks from underrepresented groups, making sure they have coaching and sponsoring and mentoring, and that there is a strategy behind how you're going to develop and advance them throughout the organization. Again, think back to where I started with having more diversity in leadership gives you better performance. And so you need to have a strategy to make that happen. making sure your onboarding process helps people to feel acclimated to their job, that they're trained from a skill perspective, but they also know and feel that they are valued and included. It doesn't matter if you say, oh, well, we talked about unconscious bias in the onboarding, which most organizations don't even do that. But if you do that, but you still don't treat people in a welcoming, respectful way, and they will not affirm that they have been treated well and welcomed, then you haven't done the job. So think about that. Promotion and advancement of underrepresented groups, again, proportional to their representation in the organization. So you need to constantly be thinking about representation, and again, have target, strategy, and plans. So if you have 30% of your workforce that is entry level, and those 30%, 30% of that 30% is people of color, then you need to make sure, or diverse or underrepresented groups of people, then you need to be thinking about how can we spread that across the organization. And so they're not concentrated in the lowest level jobs, but you're creating an equity plan for hiring that looks at all departments at all levels and creates equity and inclusion there. When you're looking at performance reviews, turnover, all of that, you're looking again to make sure that you are maintaining equity, that you're not over firing or hiring in any particular group, that you are creating interview processes that allow for the maximum amount of, or a representative amount of diversity to come through your processes. And if you don't have it, that you are trying to understand what is the barrier in the process so that you can change it to create more equity and inclusion. Ensuring that job design and classification is evaluated for bias as well as compensation, and looking at that across all the dimensions of diversity. And by that, I mean age, gender, identity, race, ethnicity, disability, veteran status, and whatever else I'm not thinking about, level of the organization, job classification, all those things you need to be checking to see if there's any bias in the process. If you're paying people less because as consciously or unconsciously, whether you're paying people less who fall into any of those categories or dimensions. So you're systematically reviewing job requirements and classifications and all of that. So you're auditing those processes. And I would say at a minimum, you want to do that annually and check to see if there's any kind of adverse impact in the way you are paying people or classifying people's jobs. So you're looking at job descriptions and requirements, making sure that certain jobs are not overburdened or under, that you aren't having extraordinary qualifications for particular categories of jobs that would be a barrier for people. Looking at the language in your job descriptions and postings, making sure that you are willing to give people accommodations and that isn't a barrier. Sometimes certain people in the organizations are just know they're not going to give any accommodations, and accommodations can be anything from flexibility in schedule to working remote versus working in person, to getting someone a special chair because they need it for back issues, or it could be having a bigger screen because they need to be able to see better, or hearing aids, or whatever it might be, interpreters, language interpreters. Accommodations come in all varieties. So are we being accommodating with regard to accommodations? Making sure that pay is based on job requirements and performance, not on favor or preference for any particular group, and that you're conducting those on a regular basis, those compensation analyses to root out any potential bias or discrimination. Number 7 is to achieve work-life integration, flexibility, and equitable benefits. So making sure that all of any sort of flexibility is done in an equitable fashion. Again, not doing things based on who is, who are the people who are my go-to folks, who are the people that I have a bias toward, or saying no to the people I have a bias against, but really trying to understand that whole process. So you're looking at performance management based on output, contribution, and impact, that any kinds of benefits and services that you are providing are specific to the diverse needs of employees based on ongoing assessment of the employee's needs. So it may be that a person's situation changes. And so you're looking at that and making sure that you make those adjustments in an equitable fashion. I forgot about religious practices when it comes to accommodations. There are those that need to be made. And again, we can be flexible even with religious accommodations, which many people balk at that. But as long as you're not violating any civil rights acts or any kind of legal requirements, you can make accommodations for that. And you should be looking for ways to, again, create an environment where people can thrive and do their best work. So leaders also are prioritizing safety, security, and wellness. Wellness has been a popular thing in the workplace. It had been pre-COVID, and I'm sure it will be again. We're now talking more about mental health and wellness as well. So asking yourselves as an organization, what are you doing in that space to make sure that we're being equitable and inclusive and creating a high functioning workplace, because we have accommodated the needs that people have when it comes to their health, when it comes to safety and security, and just being the kind of workplace, again, where people can feel like they're a part of an organization that cares about who they are and that facilitates them doing their best work. A big piece that I advocate for, probably because this is what I do with organizations a lot, is just making sure that you're assessing, measuring, and researching through a DEI lens when it comes to your organization. So you're doing that with the express purpose of being able to link it to strategy, to measure impact, and to include some of these goals and objectives that come out of the assessment work into performance appraisals, recognition, and reward. So one of the ways that you can do this is to create a dashboard or a scorecard for DEI issues. That's a way for you to be readily able to see the impact the work is making, to see where there might be some risk associated with something you are doing or aren't doing. And that'll give you quick access and insight so that you can make adjustments as an organization. Making sure that you're taking into account your stakeholders' views and opinions, and when it comes to your strategy, and asking them for it on a regular basis. So if you're talking about community members, internal stakeholders, board members, suppliers, however you define stakeholders, that you're getting input from those folks on an organizational and individual level. Making sure you are, when you do your assessments, that you're reaching out to get stakeholder input, that you're doing that quantitatively as well as qualitatively. So being thoughtful about how you structure your assessment process. Assessment could mean that you just go and have a conversation once a year with your key stakeholders. It could mean filling out a survey. It could mean many different things. It could mean a combination of things, but being strategic about how you do that. And then getting information on DEI. You could also use 360 feedback, which is really helpful when you're talking about leadership and how they're functioning. You can do reverse mentoring, reverse opinion, or information gathering with leaders and employees, making sure that you provide this opportunity in multiple languages so that employees and community stakeholders have multiple ways to provide the feedback. So you can't just rely on an online survey. Some people may not have access, so it may require paper surveys or focus groups or one-on-one conversations, but be far-reaching in how you gather the information you need for assessment. Then number 9 is making your communication clear and simple and easy to understand. That is really, really important. If you're gathering metrics or doing reporting, the simpler you make it, the better it is for people to get what they need and to provide it in as many languages as possible. Make sure you have thought about what inclusive language means for your organization. We use a lot of jargon in our everyday conversation and a lot of phrases that we have used for decades. People complain about with me that, oh, well, we used to say that 20 years ago and it was fine and nobody was offended. Now everyone's so sensitive. Well, now it's like my grandmother used to tell me when I was younger, you know better, so you do better. So things, just because we used to say it doesn't make it right. So when we're thinking about our language, being careful not to use gendered language or offensive language or language that is a racial or cultural slur of some kind or that demeans someone in the disability community, just really being thoughtful and giving those communication guidelines for your organization is a really important thing to do. Set up communication that you will be able to send out regularly for DEI, but just in terms of all your organizational communication, make sure that someone, I know of people who are in the DEI role who partner with marketing and communications to make sure they proofread and they talk about language to make sure it's not offensive or harmful, especially when people are working internationally. So what seems appropriate in one country can quickly be offensive in another. So just making sure we're aware, making sure we look at the websites, the social media platforms, internal chat rooms, or whatever kind of intranet you have, however you communicate, double check that to make sure it's inclusive language and not offensive. And then make sure when it comes to your DEI objectives and goals, your plans, your strategies, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, you cannot over communicate it. There will always be someone who says they did not know, they don't understand, we're not doing enough. You just constantly communicate every time you get a chance. Make sure you communicate with the normal flow of how communication happens in your organization through newsletters, social media, chat, town halls, CEO conversations, department leadership conversations and correspondence, team meetings. Whenever there's an opportunity to talk about DEI, make sure that you do it. And then make sure you communicate any progress on your strategy or your vision to the public as well as internally on a regular basis. Make sure from the education standpoint that you are building competence among your teams, which will help you build confidence. One of the biggest concerns that I hear expressed, especially from leaders that I work with, is I don't know enough about this to feel comfortable talking to my teams. So whatever you can do to help people to learn and grow and understand DEI, the better. As a leader, whatever level you are in the organization, I believe it's your responsibility to take some of that learning as your own. That's part of your work as a leader to grow. So you should be reading, listening to podcasts, doing whatever you need to do to grow. And of course, your DEI folks will help you, but it shouldn't be their job solely. You ought to take responsibility for it yourself. So making sure that you're learning what you need, that there's a training strategy for DEI for the organization, that it's offered not only internally, but to board members, to vendors, if it needs to be, and even to the public. If you work with, and you're in a nonprofit or a public facing organization, you should be offering that education there as well. That you are looking at all of the training your organization offers to make sure that it's inclusive in terms of how it's offered and in terms of the content, that you are using blended learning opportunities. So again, thinking about the way that you teach it. Is it awareness building, skill building? Is it experiential, and blend that, but also blend it in terms of how it is offered, the mechanisms in which you offer training, and whether it's offered online, in person, podcasts, books, book clubs, video, audio, whatever, all of the ways that you can do that. And here's a whole list of different types of topics you could be training on, but really you can train in almost any area. You can think about ways to make what it is that you do more inclusive and more equitable, and target training based on what a department or a team specifically needs, as well as have some fundamental learning strategy that the whole organization will take. And you can decide. I believe that if it's a culture shift you're trying to make, then the training probably needs to be mandatory for the whole organization. If it's a skill building thing that maybe leaders are doing, then leaders would take it. If it's something specific to a department, then a department would take it. And some training will be voluntary. But if it's a big cultural shift, or you're laying foundational learning for your team, probably it should be mandatory for everyone to take it, and it should be embedded into your onboarding. And then once you get out of that foundation building phase, then you can do more optional types of training. 11 is connecting your organization's DEI and sustainability initiatives. So you want to make sure that you're aligning any of that with your DEI goals and structures, that there's a clear link between sustainability strategies and your DEI work. And there's a whole lot of information based on available to you on the government with environmental, social, and governance dimensions, as well as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Creating strategies for that is also going to be key. And then making sure that your leaders and practitioners in sustainability are participating in DEI initiatives and vice versa. Sometimes organizations will have both of those going on, and there is a lot of overlap in terms, especially if you're in doing more public facing kinds of work. There's a lot of opportunity to kind of cross-pollinate and work together on DEI and sustainability. So make sure you're thinking about that within your organization. And then number 12 is to be proactive when you're working with the public or the community, making sure that you are supporting DEI interests in the community and partnering where it makes sense for your organization. I tell people to align with organizations where you have some skill and some expertise. So if you're already in the food business and there's an organization or a community that is struggling with food deserts, then maybe that's a natural alignment for you. Or if you're doing clothing or real estate, go where you have the expertise to partner with organizations from a philanthropic perspective as well as from a DEI perspective. Think about how you can leverage the efforts that you're doing with your peers, because there may be partnerships you could do with another company and you could serve the community in that way. Really be generous when it comes to the knowledge that you gain for DEI and thinking about how you can share that with others out in the community. Make a special effort to acknowledge the indigenous communities wherever you're doing business and respect the culture and the legalities surrounding that. And make sure you encourage employees to participate in whatever volunteerism or community projects that you do, especially from the point of sharing and learning and growing from a DEI perspective. And make sure, again, that you're linking that to your sustainability practices. Embed DEI in all your product and service development. Think about how you're going to integrate it into your development cycle, and think about the community that you're going to be serving when it comes to developing products, as well as new services. Think about how you can eliminate some of the barriers to equity. Think about what you're going to do to help or come alongside your customers, your stakeholders, and community reps. And make sure that you think about perhaps some of the recognition that comes with being creative, innovative, being a leader, a best practice leader in the industry, in your industry when it comes to DEI. And then 14, integrating it to marketing and customer service. That just goes without saying. There are a lot of organizations who do this really well. So benchmarking with those organizations, doing the market analysis, and making sure that you understand what's happening in your customer base or your client base, your participant base, is going to be really important. And then having those marketing and customer services approach that are going to go across the regions where you do business, and make sure you're being thoughtful when it comes to language, to generation, to culture, to gender as well, gender identity. And then making sure your advertising strategies are inclusive, that you are reaching broadly. No longer are we just doing that thing where we have one particular group of working with, but really, if we're trying to be inclusive, we're trying to meet needs across multiple identities and break down the tendency to stereotype people. Then look outside and try to get the expertise that you need if you don't have it in-house. Partnering with other organizations, with consultants, with community members to get you the expertise you need is also a good strategy. And then making sure that accessibility and cultural sensitivity are incorporated into what you do when it comes to your marketing strategy and the materials that you are disseminating for the public. The last piece is practicing responsible and ethical sourcing. And I've been talking about this throughout the time that we've had together, but you want to make sure that you are looking for diverse suppliers and that you're being active when it comes to developing and nurturing underrepresented suppliers. A lot of times we say, oh, well, we want to have this diverse ecosystem of businesses, but we aren't coming alongside and supporting them by actually using their services as an organization or as a company. And we can be really impactful in doing that. Doing the market analysis, making sure that we understand what the organization's customer base looks like, and meeting those needs is important. And then making sure that we support the suppliers by having high standards for them to be inclusive in their practices, by educating them in best practices related to DEI, but also in the technical areas where they are helping your organization. You want to build a partnership with them so they can be the best supplier for you, and you continue to use diverse suppliers in your work. So those are really quick, all of the things that I think about when it comes to being successful in doing this DEI work. I will stick around if you have questions. I know we're right up on 2 o'clock, but I wanted to have some time to answer questions. So Andrew, I'll turn that part over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Debbie. And thank you all for showing up today. So with that, I will go ahead and pause right there. If anyone wants to come off of mute or go ahead and pop those questions into the chat, I can certainly moderate them to Debbie. So with that, I will go ahead and pause. All right, we got a question. Let's see here. So asking about the contact information, if you wouldn't mind posting that up again, Debbie. But we did have a question from Drew. What resources are available for finding diverse suppliers?
So there are a couple of organizations that have databases that you can partner with to buy. They actually are a service. They provide a service to connect you with diverse suppliers. So again, if you email me, I can send you that, that information. There are about 6 organizations that I know of that specifically work in that space for you to find them. Otherwise, I would say looking for your local chambers of commerce. So your Black Chamber of Commerce, your Latino Chamber of Commerce, your LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, and on and on and on. Those would be great places to start. And then again, if you email me, I'll hook you up with that other group.
Next question. Do you offer a DEI evaluation through your business?
If you mean by evaluation, assessment of your organizational situation, yes, we do assessments for organizations to help them understand the culture. We do HR assessments. We do just general overall organizational assessment of how DEI is working for you. And then through that process, we will make recommendations of things that you should, we recommend you change or beef up, or things even that you should eliminate in order to have a more inclusive and equitable organization.
All right. Next question. Wanted to know what kind of programs we can run to attract the most diverse candidates to enhance our DEI initiatives.
To attract candidates. That's a hard one to ask without knowing what you're already doing. But I think the best thing is to have a group of employees who are already diverse there who would attest to the fact that you are an inclusive organization. So that's one. Having employee resource groups, again, because employees will advocate for your organization and and it's a place for people to go who have particular affinities of one kind or another. Making sure that you have talent development programs for people from diverse backgrounds or underrepresented backgrounds. So a couple of organizations right there in Madison that I know of have fairly robust leadership programs for folks that they're trying to move into leadership roles. So they put them through, in one case, a year's worth of training and development in all aspects of leadership, including bias and inclusion, to get them prepared for those leadership roles. Another organization, if you have publicly made a commitment to hiring and advancing candidates who are underrepresented, that also goes a long way. You've made the commitment and you're actually doing it. Having diverse interview pools or interviewers is a good way to do that. Making a commitment to have diverse interview pools for every job is also a good way to do it. Making sure that you are communicating and posting your job openings to diverse groups of people through diverse organizations, and then getting out there and networking personally is also a really good way to do that.
Next question. Do you have an online resource for employee trainings that you like? Specifically looking for ones like unconscious bias, anti-harassment, things of that nature.
No. I don't do a lot of online training, so I don't know of a lot of them, unfortunately. I do a lot of in-person training. I'm trying to think. So I don't really know of a great online resource for that. I'm sorry. I know of a lot of good trainers, but not online.
Sure. Well, that looks to be all the questions that have come in this time. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to join us here. Thank you, Debbie. One last question popped in. Do you have any suggestions for additional DEI resources, specifically for marketing teams and marketing initiatives? We are working in higher ed.
I'm trying to think. Marketing teams. No, but Lisa, email me. We can connect and talk about that.
Just popped your email in the chat there last time. Make sure everyone has that contact information. So yeah, it looks to be about all the questions. We will go ahead and cap it there. Thank you all. Thank you, Debbie. I posted those links earlier in the chat too about our upcoming events, in addition to our YouTube page that houses many of our events that we have recorded since the end of March 2020. So with that being said, we will cap it there and we will see you all next time. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.